In just 7 minutes, Jasmine Crockett, a black woman and a White House official, was fined $10,000 simply for wearing a small silver cross on her collar. Inside a courtroom filled with people in vulgar t-shirts and flashy chains, no one else was questioned, only her. The setting? Washington, D.C., the very heart of American justice. But instead of upholding the law, the court became a weapon against her faith. Why was she singled out? What happened next turned a $10,000 receipt into a symbol that shook the entire country. Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. The sun was setting over Washington, D.C. when Jasmine Crockett finally sat down to rest. Just a few blocks from the White House, her apartment was quiet until the secure line rang. She answered immediately. "Jasmine," the voice on the line said. It was President Trump. "There's a situation at the D.C. local courthouse. A group of Christians was banned from praying in public. I want you there. Now." Click. The line went dead. No room for debate. No time to think. Jasmine stood up at once, slipped on her heels, grabbed her document bag, and buttoned her blazer. On her collar, the silver cross she always wore caught the last light of day. It wasn't just jewelry, it was her faith, and today it might become the reason she'd be targeted. She had faced press attacks, political firestorms, and national scandals. But this would be different. This wasn't about politics, it was personal. She was walking into a courtroom not just as the White House press secretary, but as a woman of faith. And something inside told her, this time the fight would hit deeper than ever. The moment Jasmine Crockett stepped through the glass doors of the D.C. local courthouse, the noise hit her like a wave. Dozens of people packed the waiting area, arguing over parking tickets, whispering to lawyers, pacing back and forth in nervous loops. Phones buzzed despite the sign saying no devices. The air smelled of stale coffee, printer ink, and tension. This wasn't a temple of justice. It was a pressure cooker. The clerks moved like machines, stamping documents without looking up. Bailiffs stood at attention, but their eyes looked tired, disillusioned. Everything about the place screamed routine chaos. And in the middle of that chaos, Jasmine spotted a small wooden placard that read, "Judge Charles Hargrove, Courtroom 2. That was the name she had been warned about, and now she was about to meet him. When Judge Hargrove entered the room, the noise died instantly. 62, tall and sharp-edged, he walked with the stiff precision of a man who believed rules were religion. His robe was immaculate, his silver hair combed straight back, and his wire-framed glasses sat like daggers across the bridge of his nose. He didn't smile. He didn't nod. He just scanned the room as if every person present was already guilty of something. Hargrove was infamous in certain legal circles, known for his unusually harsh treatment of cases involving religious symbols. Hijabs, crosses, prayer beads. He'd fine people for all of it under the excuse of maintaining order. Jasmine had read about him in briefings, but seeing him in person was different. The courtroom didn't breathe when he was inside. As Jasmine adjusted her seat, she kept her focus straight ahead, silently reviewing what she'd been sent to observe. Around her, the courtroom buzzed with the low murmur of shuffling papers, irritated sighs, and half-hearted conversations. To her left, a man in his 30s leaned back in his seat, arms crossed, wearing a black hoodie emblazoned with the phrase "Freedom is dead" in bold, blood-red lettering. The message was confrontational, almost designed to provoke. But no one blinked. No clerk made a note. No bailiff leaned in. Across the aisle, a woman in high heels clacked in late, her necklace so enormous it hung down to her waist like a trophy from a Vegas showgirl routine. It sparkled under the flickering courtroom lights, more distracting than anything Jasmine had seen in a press room. But again, not a word. No disapproval, no warning, no fine. This courtroom clearly had no dress code problem. Unless, of course, your attire reflected faith. That's when she felt it. A stare, sharp as glass and twice as cold. Her eyes flicked up and met his. Judge Charles Hargrove. He wasn't listening to the current case. He wasn't looking at files. His gaze was locked directly on her, more precisely, on the small silver cross resting quietly on the edge of her blazer collar. It wasn't flashy. It didn't shine like the woman's necklace or shout like the man's hoodie. But to Hargrove, it may as well have been a threat. His eyes narrowed behind thin wire-frame glasses, his jaw tightening. Jasmine didn't move, didn't touch the cross. She knew better. The way he was looking at her wasn't neutral. It was personal. In a courtroom supposedly governed by objectivity, his expression betrayed something deeper, bias in plain sight. She scanned the room again. Same necklace, same hoodie, still no reprimand. She glanced at the posted guidelines on the wall. Nothing about religious symbols. No sign forbidding expressions of faith. But the tension in the air told her this wasn't about official rules. It was about selective enforcement. One set of rules for everyone else, and a different set for her because of one tiny piece of metal and everything it represented. The cross didn't disrupt the court. The court was already a mess of chatter and confusion. But somehow her silence spoke too loud for Hargrove's comfort. Jasmine knew this type of bias. She'd seen it before, in headlines, in protests, in whispered stories from constituents, but now it was staring her down from the bench. This wasn't just prejudice. It was targeted, deliberate. Hargrove hadn't said a word yet, but his posture, his stare, the narrowing of his eyes, it was all building towards something. The courtroom was full of noise, but in Jasmine's world, time slowed. She could feel it coming. Not because she was loud, not because she was out of order, but because she wore a cross. Quietly, proudly, legally. And that, in Hargrove's courtroom, seemed to be the one thing he couldn't tolerate. The courtroom had just begun to settle when the heavy oak door behind the bench creaked open. Judge Charles Hargrove entered like a shadow stretching across the floor. Tall, rigid, and already scanning for control. Without a word, he adjusted his robe, placed both hands flat on the bench, and sat down as if the chair itself belonged to him alone. The clerk whispered something. The bailiff called the room to order. "All rise!" echoed through the chamber like routine thunder. Everyone stood, Jasmine included, her posture sharp, her phone in one hand, her cross still gleaming subtly on her collar. Hargrove didn't smile. He didn't nod. He went straight into the docket like a machine loaded with grudges. First case, fined. Second, dismissed. Third, warned and moved along. His rhythm was fast, cold, calculated, until he stopped, mid-motion, mid-sentence. His hand froze over the next file. His head tilted slightly. And then, like a radar locking onto signal, his eyes found her. The room hadn't noticed yet, but Jasmine felt it. That stare, precise, burning, unmistakably personal. It didn't search her face or posture. It went straight to the tiny silver cross on her collar. His jaw flexed. The fingers gripping his gavel curled tighter. There was no confusion on his face, just irritation, maybe even contempt. He leaned forward, the bench groaning under his weight, and then said it. Not as a suggestion, not as a request, but as a command. "Miss Crockett," he called, voice calm but cutting. "Remove that cross. This is a courtroom, not a church." The air shifted, audibly. Chairs creaked as people turned to look. The woman with the chandelier-sized necklace gasped softly. The man with the "Freedom is Dead" hoodie sat up straighter, suddenly aware he wasn't the most controversial figure in the room anymore. Jasmine didn't move, not even an inch. Her expression didn't change. But inside, her pulse slowed into combat rhythm. She had been expecting pressure. Yes. Tension, certainly. But a direct public order to remove her faith? That was something else entirely. Jasmine didn't rush to respond. She stood motionless, letting the weight of the judge's demand hang in the air like a loaded weapon. Around her, the silence cracked with tension. Whispers halted mid-breath. Fingers froze above keyboards. She looked straight at Judge Hargrove, her posture calm but unshakably firm. Then, with the same clarity she had once used to deliver White House briefings under global pressure, she spoke. Not for applause, not for defiance, but for truth. "Your Honor, with respect," she began, her voice controlled, but resonant enough to pierce every corner of the room. "What I wear, this cross, is not a statement of protest. It's not a disruption. It's protected expression under the First Amendment of the Constitution." She didn't blink. She let the words land, their authority more powerful than volume. The judge didn't interrupt. Couldn't. Her tone was too deliberate, her reasoning too precise. The First Amendment guarantees freedom of religion, and that includes the right to express one's faith in public settings, so long as it does not incite disorder. I am not chanting. I am not preaching. I am wearing a symbol, quietly, peacefully, and lawfully. Murmurs rippled through the gallery, people shifting in their seats, nudging each other with subtle disbelief. No one had ever heard anyone speak to Hargrove that way, certainly not without being shut down. But Jasmine pressed on. I have reviewed the posted guidelines for this courtroom. Nowhere does it prohibit religious attire or symbols. If such a policy exists, it must be written, public, and constitutionally valid. Otherwise, what you've asked of me is not enforcement, it's personal. The judge's hand tightened around his gavel. His knuckles whitened. But still, he said nothing. Your Honor, she added, slower now, each word enunciated like a lawyer drafting history. I am here not as a protester, not as a preacher, but as an observer, sent by the President of the United States to monitor a case about religious discrimination. And if you are willing to fine me or threaten me because I wear this cross, then I suggest we are no longer just observing the issue, we are now living it. The room went completely still. Even the bailiff seemed frozen. Across the gallery, someone shifted their phone under the bench, discreetly trying to record. Jasmine's eyes never left Hargrove's. She didn't raise her voice, didn't strike a dramatic pose. She simply stood, with the full force of constitutional law behind her, and reminded a courtroom built on authority that even judges bow to the Bill of Rights. The sound of the gavel hitting wood wasn't just loud, it was brutal. It didn't signal order. It sounded like punishment, deliberate, personal, final. And then came the words, spoken with such clinical coldness, they could have been delivered by a machine. Miss Crockett, you are hereby fined $5,000 for contempt of court, Judge Hargrove declared, each syllable pronounced like a sentence in stone. This courtroom is not a stage for protest. Refusing to comply with my direct order is a violation of the dignity of these proceedings. Payable today. Gasps didn't just ripple. They cracked through the air like breaking glass. A woman near the back audibly choked on her breath. The clerk's fingers hovered above the keys, frozen in disbelief. Even the bailiff, who had stood like a statue for the past hour, shifted uncomfortably, one brow twitching. $5,000. For standing silently. For refusing to remove a cross. For defending the Constitution. It wasn't just an overreaction. It was an act of intimidation wrapped in legal authority. No due process, no escalation, no prior warning. Just $5,000 dropped like a weapon from the bench. Hargrove hadn't even cited a statute. He hadn't asked questions. He didn't quote law. He just declared it and expected obedience. Because Jasmine had refused to shrink. Because she didn't tremble when told to surrender her faith. Across the courtroom, the disparity was now blinding. The man in the hoodie still sat there, arms crossed. The words, "Freedom is dead," screaming from his chest like a protest banner. Not a word had been said to him. The woman with the gaudy gold chain still leaned back, smiling faintly, untouched by rules. But Jasmine, who had merely spoken with clarity, invoked her constitutional rights and stood still with a cross, was now branded a violator of courtroom order. $5,000. It wasn't a fine. It was a message. A declaration that in this courtroom, faith came with a price tag. That questioning authority, when done with principle, would be punished harder than shouting or chaos. And everyone in that room knew it. The gallery had stopped murmuring. They were watching now, eyes flicking between Jasmine and the judge like spectators to a rigged duel. This wasn't justice. It was dominance. And Jasmine? She didn't blink. Her breath stayed steady. Her shoulders never sagged. She didn't plead, didn't argue. She let the number speak for itself. Because deep down, she understood what Hargrove didn't. The louder the injustice, the clearer the truth becomes. She had just been fined $5,000 for wearing a cross in silence. And now the whole world would know it. But what no one in that courtroom could have guessed was that Jasmine hadn't come unprepared. Behind her silence was strategy, and inside her blazer, the truth was already recording. Long before Judge Hargrove entered, before the courtroom even came into view, Jasmine Crockett knew today wasn't routine. Something about the briefing, the assignment, the urgency of the president's voice on the phone, it all felt loaded, like she wasn't walking into a courthouse but into the eye of a storm disguised as procedure. Her steps down the courthouse hallway were measured, heels clicking softly on the tile, each echo bouncing back like a warning. She didn't hesitate. The moment she crossed the metal detectors and cleared the front security desk, her fingers slid into the inner lining of her blazer. Hidden there, tucked into the fabric near her ribs, was her phone. Already in airplane mode, already prepared. With a subtle press of her thumb and a half-inch swipe across the screen, the recorder lit up silently. No sound, no vibration, no light. Just red numbers counting upward. Jasmine wasn't breaking the law. She was protecting herself from it being twisted, because she'd seen it before. She'd watched seasoned men with titles and black robes turn bias into rulings. She'd seen silence punished harder than noise. She knew how power worked in rooms like this. And today she wore two things they'd hate, a badge from the White House and a cross on her collar. The first made her a political enemy. The second, in the wrong courtroom, made her a target. So she made a choice. Document everything. Not because she didn't trust herself, but because she knew they wouldn't. Not when things turned, not when she'd be called disruptive, or arrogant, or contemptuous. Not when they tried to say she provoked it. In a place where power came from height and robes and centuries of unchecked control, Jasmine knew the only real protection left was evidence. Unfiltered, time-stamped, indisputable. As she entered the courtroom and slid into her seat, the phone in her inner pocket hummed softly with digital memory. Every word, every breath, every command. It would all be there. Not just for review, but for history. Jasmine Crockett wasn't just attending a court hearing. She was walking into a trap with her eyes wide open, and a recorder quietly capturing every bar of the cage. For a moment, it looked like Jasmine might simply accept the injustice and return to her seat. That was exactly what Hargrove expected. Silent compliance, just enough dignity left to avoid humiliation. But Jasmine Crockett had never been built for silence under pressure. Slowly, deliberately, she reached into the black leather document bag resting on the table before her. Every eye in the courtroom tracked her movement, unsure if she was folding or preparing to fight. Her fingers closed around a familiar edge. Not a phone, not a speech, but authority itself. In one swift, practiced motion, she pulled out a slim identification wallet and opened it to face the bench. A sharp glint of gold caught the overhead lights. The presidential seal stared back at the courtroom. Official, unmistakable, impossible to ignore. A collective breath caught across the room. Even the bailiff's brow lifted. Jasmine didn't raise her voice, but her words sliced through the tension like a blade through glass. Your Honor, allow me to clarify who I am before this escalates further. I am Jasmine Crockett, White House Press Secretary. I am here on direct assignment from President Donald J. Trump, tasked with observing this trial and reporting on any potential violations of constitutional rights, particularly those involving freedom of religious expression. The room changed. It didn't just react, it recoiled. The murmurs began immediately, first from the gallery, then spreading like a slow quake to the front row. Hargrove's lips parted slightly, but no sound emerged. He sat back, the weight of what had just been revealed pressing down like a second gavel. For the first time, the power dynamics shifted. Not because Jasmine had shouted or threatened or stormed out, but because she had exposed the truth in full daylight, and that truth had a presidential seal behind it. She had been treated like a disruption, like an agitator, like a nobody. And now the courtroom saw her for what she was, a high-ranking federal official sent to observe abuses exactly like this one. The clerk glanced up in visible panic. Cameras weren't rolling, but everyone felt like they were suddenly on the record. Hargrove swallowed. His face, flushed from the earlier exchange, now turned pale. Because now it wasn't just Jasmine's word against his. It was Jasmine's title, her mission, her evidence, her access to every media outlet and constitutional attorney in the nation. And worst of all for him, she hadn't even begun yet. Jasmine slowly lowered the wallet, not needing to say anything more. Her presence had already rewritten the room. What had moments ago been a one-sided abuse of power was now a courtroom on edge, watching a judge silently calculate the weight of his mistake. And Jasmine, calm, controlled, relentless, stood exactly where he had tried to push her out, still wearing the cross, still standing her ground, still undefeated. Jasmine took one step forward, not out of defiance but as a declaration. Her voice was composed, but behind every word was steel. Your Honor, with all due respect, I must place this court on notice, not just ethically, but constitutionally, she said, her tone measured and commanding. In the case of Church of Lukumi Babalu Ayer versus City of Hialeah, the United States Supreme Court ruled, without ambiguity, that any law, ruling, or enforcement which directly targets religious practice or symbols without compelling interest and neutral application violates the First Amendment. The courtroom quieted further, breaths drawn in but not released. Even the clerk, who had been furiously typing, slowed her keystrokes to listen. The city of Hialeah passed ordinances that appeared neutral on their face, but were designed to suppress a specific religious practice. The court saw through that. They ruled it unconstitutional because the law, though cloaked in secular language, was enforced in a way that targeted faith. That is precisely what is happening in this courtroom today. She turned her body slightly, addressing not just the bench now, but the full courtroom, the crowd, the observers, the court staff. Every soul within those walls became a witness to what she said next. Let's examine the facts as they exist in this room, she continued, voice sharpening. A man sits in the back, wearing a hoodie that reads, boldly, "Freedom is dead." No objection, no fine, no reprimand. A woman strolls in 10 minutes late with a necklace so large it reflects light across half the gallery. Not a word, no citation, no contempt. Her voice hardened, not louder, but heavier. I, on the other hand, have sat silently, respectfully, wearing a small silver cross, one that does not make noise, does not disrupt, does not threaten the integrity of these proceedings, and for that, I've been fined $5,000. Not for conduct, not for contempt, but for belief. The weight of that number pressed on the room. She paused, letting the injustice fester in the silence. This court did not act neutrally, she said, her words like blades slicing through the quiet. It acted selectively, and the standard applied to me, because of what I wear and what it represents, was not applied to others whose attire is objectively more distracting, arguably more confrontational, and absolutely more visible. All eyes were now off Hargrove and on her. No longer an observer, no longer a passive participant. She had taken the floor, not by force, but by truth. The Supreme Court's decision in Lukumi Babalu wasn't just about a city law. It was about unequal enforcement, about power wielded under the guise of neutrality, but used to target the vulnerable. That is what I see here today. Not the law, not justice, but bias, cloaked in black robes and now exposed under white fluorescent light. Judge Hargrove remained still, but his grip on the gavel had loosened. His knuckles, once pale with control, now trembled slightly. The gallery was utterly still, as if afraid to move, to break the spell of her testimony. So I ask again, not as a woman of faith, but as a legal officer of the United States government, what law have I broken? What disruption have I caused? And if you cannot answer those questions equally for every person in this room, then I suggest this fine is not lawful, it is discriminatory. She didn't need to raise her voice. She didn't need theatrics. The courtroom itself had become her evidence. The silence from the bench, the nervous energy in the air, the wide eyes of strangers realizing what they just witnessed, it all told the same story. She hadn't broken the rules. She had just refused to kneel to the ones breaking them. The silence was not peaceful, it was suffocating, the kind that follows an explosion, where no one knows whether to speak or run. Jasmine's words still echoed, not just in the ears of those present, but in their conscience. You could see it in their posture. the way the clerk's hands trembled slightly above the keyboard, unsure whether to keep typing or simply bear witness. The man in the "Freedom is Dead" hoodie leaned forward, as if he too had just realized the court was no longer a neutral room. It was a trap that had been sprung in front of everyone. And at the center of it all, Judge Hargrove didn't move. His back remained straight, his robe unmoving, but his face had cracked. The mask of control, of untouchable authority, had fractured in subtle but undeniable ways. His pupils twitched, first to Jasmine, then to the gallery, then to nowhere at all. His hand still rested near the gavel, but it no longer projected confidence. It was clenched, white-knuckled, tense. He wasn't deliberating, he was recalibrating. He hadn't expected a challenge, not like this. Not from a woman, not from a cross, and certainly not from someone carrying both constitutional law and presidential authority in her pocket. And worse, she had used them flawlessly. No shouting, no grandstanding. Just fact, case law, and an undeniable display of composure that made him look like exactly what he was trying not to be. Biased, emotional, and afraid. But men like Hargrove don't fold under truth. They dig in. "Miss Crockett," he said finally, but it was more of a hiss than a sentence. His voice, no longer booming, had gone flat and clipped. Controlled rage. "You seem to believe that quoting precedent and waiving credentials gives you the right to disregard courtroom decorum." Jasmine didn't respond. She didn't need to. The silence that followed was its own verdict. "This is my courtroom," he continued, each word now surgically cold. "Not a stage for political performance." That was when the clerk looked up, visibly startled, because he wasn't talking like a judge anymore. He was talking like a man cornered, a man bleeding power, trying desperately to patch it with bravado. But everyone in the room felt the shift. This wasn't law. This was retaliation wrapped in robe and ego. Still, Jasmine stood motionless, not out of fear, but out of strategy. Every second he spoke was another moment exposing himself. Every angry word another inch he pulled the curtain back, revealing not a dispenser of justice, but a man rattled by a woman who refused to bow. And so, the room held its breath again. Because the question wasn't whether Hargrove had been shaken. It was what he would do next to try and take back control. Hargrove's breathing shifted, barely perceptible to most, but Jasmine saw it. The moment when control slips just enough for the mask to crack. His gaze swept across her again, this time not searching for argument, but for ammunition. And then he spotted it. A flicker. Barely visible, nestled beneath the inside flap of her blazer. A soft, blinking red light. It wasn't loud, it wasn't disruptive. But to Hargrove, it was a gift. A target. His eyes lit up, not with relief, but with vengeance. "Miss Crockett," he said, voice suddenly sharp again. "Is that a recording device?" Jasmine didn't flinch. "Yes, Your Honor," she replied clearly. "I began recording at the start of the session. Discreetly, silently, for accountability purposes, as is permitted by legal observers in jurisdictions that allow it, especially when no signage or announcement prohibits it." The words were clinical, factual, but in a courtroom already straining under the weight of exposed bias, they sounded like defiance. The gavel slammed down so hard the clerk jolted. "That is unauthorized recording," Hargrove barked, louder now, his voice cracking under the strain of his own fury. "This courtroom does not permit private individuals to record proceedings without prior approval." He leaned forward, voice dropping to a growl. "You have violated courtroom protocol, disrupted judicial decorum, and shown open disregard for this institution. For that, I am imposing an additional $5,000 fine." It didn't feel like a court ruling. It felt like a personal execution. The number rang out not once, but twice. $10,000. Not for a crime, not for causing harm, but for two acts that, under any fair legal lens, would have been dismissed as constitutionally protected or too minor to mention. Wearing a cross and quietly recording in a public space. There was no logic behind the figure, and Hargrove hadn't even tried to dress it up. He just dropped it like a hammer and leaned back, gavel twitching in his grip, as if daring anyone to question his authority. The effect was immediate. Gasps rippled through the courtroom like an invisible shockwave. Not dramatic, Real. People looked at each other as if silently confirming, did he really just say that? Mouths hung open. The woman with the oversized necklace finally shifted uncomfortably, pressing her lips into a thin, guilty line. Even the man in the freedom is dead. Hoodie stopped fidgeting with his sleeves, now sitting still. Stunned, no longer the boldest statement in the room. The clerk paused mid-keystroke, then backspaced, then typed again. Her fingers were visibly trembling. This fine had no precedent. Not for contempt, not for disruption, not for anything remotely legal. It was punitive, personal, an overreach so massive it didn't just cross a line. It obliterated it, and everyone knew it. Somewhere in the back row, a man muttered under his breath, 10 grand? For a necklace and a phone? His friend didn't answer, just stared forward, jaw tight. The silence was deafening, not because the room had no sound, but because there was no justification left to fill it. This wasn't a courtroom anymore. It was a stage, and Jasmine Crockett had just been turned into the lead in a play called This Is What Happens When You Don't Bow. There was a long, loaded pause after Hargrove's declaration. $10,000. The number still hovered in the air like smoke after a fire. Everyone in the courtroom watched Jasmine, expecting the inevitable. Shock, outrage, maybe even an emotional collapse. After all, who walks into a courtroom and walks out $10,000 lighter for wearing a cross and pressing record? But Jasmine Crockett didn't blink. She didn't ask for reconsideration. She didn't beg. What she did was far more powerful and far more dangerous to those who thought money could be used to shame her into silence. She opened her leather bag with a smooth, practiced motion and pulled out a navy blue checkbook, government issued with a gold-trimmed edge. The kind not everyone gets. The room fell utterly still as she uncapped her pen, placed the checkbook on the clerk's table, and began to write. Her handwriting was precise, deliberate, almost calligraphic. One digit at a time, she inscribed the amount, 10,000/100. She didn't write quickly. She wrote clearly, ensuring that everyone in that courtroom knew. This wasn't payment, it was evidence. Then without a word, she tore the check free. The sound, a clean, confident rip, was louder than the last gavel strike. She held it between two fingers and walked it forward, heels clacking like punctuation on tile. When she reached the clerk's desk, she didn't place it down gently. She laid it down like a file marked Exhibit A. Then came the second blow. I want a formal receipt, Jasmine said, voice even, but sharpened to the bone, with a line-by-line record of why this fine was imposed. The clerk looked up, wide-eyed, caught between obedience and disbelief. Jasmine didn't blink. Write it exactly as it was delivered, she said. 5,000 for refusing to remove a religious symbol protected by the Constitution. 5,000 more for silently recording a public proceeding in a courtroom where no visible policy prohibits it. The clerk nodded slowly, her fingers trembling as they hovered above the form. Jasmine wasn't done. I also request that the court transcript reflect, in full detail, Judge Hargrove's language, tone, and justification for both fines, as well as the complete timeline of courtroom behavior leading up to them. She turned, addressing the court reporter directly. Every word, every pause, every ruling, no omissions, because if I'm going to pay $10,000 to this institution, the country deserves to know exactly what they got for the money. A ripple moved through the gallery, no longer just shock, but admiration. Jasmine wasn't just complying. She was converting injustice into documentation. She was turning punishment into proof. She returned to her place, standing tall, and faced the judge one last time. Her voice no longer needed to rise. It was the stillness, the steel behind the calm, that carried the true weight. Let the record show, she said firmly, that I paid the price for not surrendering my beliefs. And let the record also show that I never backed down, not for 1 second. Then she turned slightly, her eyes sweeping across the hushed courtroom, past the judge, past the clerk, past the crowd, straight into the moral heart of the moment. This money doesn't buy silence, she declared, her voice now like a bell ringing through stone. But this receipt, This receipt will be a living record for every courtroom, every newsroom, and every American watching. This receipt will be proof that I stood my ground and that a judge tried to price out my faith. The room didn't gasp this time. It held its breath. Because what Jasmine had just said wasn't defiance. It was history. Jasmine didn't wait to leave the courthouse. The moment the glass doors shut behind her, she walked straight to the curb where her black SUV idled, engine humming like a heartbeat before a charge. She opened the door, slid into the back seat, and gave a single nod to the driver. "Don't move. Give me 2 minutes." The door clicked shut behind her. Silence. Inside the vehicle, the chaos of the courtroom faded, but the fire inside her had only sharpened. She reached into her blazer, pulled out her phone, and unlocked it with a quick fingerprint scan. Her hands were steady. Her mind was surgical. First, she opened her encrypted storage app and retrieved the complete audio file. Every word, every breath, every gavel strike from the moment she walked in. Then came the scanned image of the official receipt, $10,000 dated, time-stamped, signed by the court clerk, and finally the court transcript, which she had demanded in full. It wasn't just lines of dialogue, it was now an indictment. Every quote from Hargrove, every irrational ruling, every ounce of bias now immortalized in black and white. She assembled them all in one message. The recipient? Matthew Reese, President Trump's senior legal counsel and crisis strategist. Subject line, judicial misconduct, urgent action required. Then she began to type, Judge Charles Hargrove issued $10,000 in fines against me. $5,000 for wearing a cross, $5,000 for silently recording. No formal courtroom signage prohibiting recordings. No written dress code banning religious symbols. Transcript and receipt attached. Recording confirms discriminatory enforcement. Clerk and bailiff visibly uncomfortable. Entire courtroom witnessed disproportionate treatment, urging immediate legal review and press coordination. This cannot go unchallenged, not just for me, but for the precedent it sets. She paused only to recheck the attachments, then hit send. A blue check mark flashed instantly. Delivered. Read. She leaned back in her seat for the first time that day, the adrenaline still high in her veins. She wasn't just reporting what happened. She was detonating a chain reaction. And she knew it. This wasn't just about her dignity. It was about the Constitution, about whether a woman, black, brilliant, and unapologetically faithful, could walk into a courtroom in the United States and not be fined into silence. The moment that message left her phone, the battle shifted. It was no longer just about gavel strikes and courtroom tension. It had become evidence in the hands of the West Wing, and Jasmine Crockett had just made sure the entire federal apparatus would hear what happened inside that courtroom. Word for word, dollar by dollar, line by unconstitutional line. It started with a shaky phone camera and a silent thumb hovering over the record button. The person holding it, an anonymous young woman seated in the third row, had seen enough by then. She'd watched the gavel slam down. She'd watched the $10,000 fine handed out like a personal vendetta. But what made her press record wasn't the punishment. It was what Jasmine did next. With unwavering calm, Jasmine Crockett tore a personal check from her government-issued book, stepped forward, and laid it down on the clerk's desk like a legal landmine. Then came the line, quiet but sharp, captured clearly on the phone's mic. This money doesn't buy silence, but this receipt will be a living record for the entire country. The video was only 37 seconds long, but by the time Jasmine exited the courtroom, it was already spreading. It appeared first in a private group chat of law students. Then it hit a faith-based civil liberties Discord. By noon, it had crossed platforms, from TikTok to X to Instagram threads. It reached 50,000 views in an hour, then 100,000, then 1 million. People weren't just watching it, they were sharing it with commentary like, "She didn't just pay the fine, she weaponized the receipt." Others posted screenshots of the check, overlaid with bold font, $10,000 for faith. By the end of the day, the hashtag number cross in court had over 1.2 million mentions and was trending in 6 countries. A viral TikTok remix edited Jasmine's walk to the clerk's desk over Hans Zimmer's Time, and within 2 hours, even celebrities were reposting it. One pastor in Georgia went live in front of his congregation and said, "You want to see courage in 2025? Watch Jasmine Crockett write that check. Watch her speak to power like it's her courtroom, not theirs." Twitter was on fire. A major constitutional law account with 3 million followers posted, "The court tried to make her pay for her faith. Instead, she turned their penalty into policy. Jasmine Crockett just gave us a masterclass in resistance." Another user put it bluntly, "She didn't bring a cross into court. She brought the First Amendment and made the gavel blink." Media outlets scrambled to verify. CNN called it one of the most powerful viral courtroom moments of the decade. Fox News called it proof the system fears people who know their rights. MSNBC aired the clip on loop with a legal panel debating whether Judge Hargrove's actions constituted constitutional overreach. And amid the frenzy, the question wasn't just about Jasmine anymore. It was about how many other people had been fined, silenced, or dismissed for quietly practicing their beliefs. Faith communities launched threads under the hashtag stories of fines for crosses, hijabs, yarmulkes, each one echoing Jasmine's moment. And at the center of it all was that 37-second video. No screaming, no outrage, just precision, restraint, and the kind of power that doesn't ask permission. Jasmine didn't post the video. She didn't have to. The internet had already turned her into something more than a witness. She had become a movement in motion. By 3:57 p.m., Jasmine's name was already trending in every major city in the United States. Her inbox was overflowing. Journalists were circling like sharks. Legal analysts were picking apart the transcript. But the real thunderclap came 5 minutes later from 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. At exactly 4:02 p.m., President Donald J. Trump's personal account on X, followed by over 120 million people globally, posted a message that didn't just speak, it roared. The screen lit up in bold font. Jasmine Crockett is a symbol of freedom under attack. Fined $10,000 for wearing a cross and recording the abuse? Total disgrace. This is not justice. This is religious discrimination. Pure and simple. She stood tall. She stood for millions. I am proud of her. Crossing court. Faith is not crime. The tweet hit like an air raid siren across social media. Within 60 seconds, it had racked up 35,000 retweets. In 3 minutes, it was on Fox News, Newsmax, OAN, and every conservative outlet's homepage. In 5 minutes, CNN broke its scheduled programming for a breaking news alert, flashing Trump's words across the screen with an urgent banner, "President weighs in on courtroom religious freedom case." And the effect was immediate, polarizing, mobilizing, electrifying. Trump's base surged. Senators reposted the message with statements like, "Faith is not illegal. Government overreach must end. And if this can happen to the White House press secretary, it can happen to any American." Churches across Texas, Florida, and Ohio began planning prayer vigils. Hashtags like "Stand with Jasmine," "Faith on Trial," and "This is why we fight" began trending within hours. Christian radio stations aired segments titled "The $10,000 Cross," Jasmine's Battle for Religious Liberty. But it wasn't just the faithful who responded. It was legal scholars, civil rights advocates, First Amendment organizations. One notable constitutional lawyer tweeted, "President Trump isn't wrong. The Constitution doesn't bend to personal bias in a robe. What happened in that courtroom is judicial malpractice, and Jasmine Crockett made sure we all saw it." Inside the West Wing, the communications office scrambled to turn this into a campaign advantage. The press secretary drafted a statement. Trump's senior advisors briefed him for Sunday talk shows. By that evening, Jasmine Crockett was no longer just a name. She was a national symbol. And Judge Charles Hargrove, he was still in his chambers, unaware that the President of the United States had just publicly eviscerated his authority in front of the entire country. But the notification would come, and when it did, it wouldn't just shake his courtroom, it would shatter the walls around everything he thought was untouchable. At exactly 7:13 a.m., before the city's noise crept into the marble corridors of the D.C. Judicial Oversight Council, Mrs. Eleanor Thompson arrived alone. No lawyer, no press, just the steady click of her low-heeled shoes echoing down the hallway like a metronome of reckoning. Clutched in her gloved hands was an old leather-bound notebook, edges frayed, cover faded, but inside, untouched by time. Her breath was shallow, but her grip was firm. She didn't come as a whistleblower. She came as a woman who had carried the weight of quiet injustice for 12 years and finally decided that silence was no longer survival. It was complicity. She stepped into the council hearing room and placed the notebook carefully on the long oak table like it was radioactive. The investigators, 5 in all, looked up, unsure of what to expect, until she opened it. The room shifted. Page after page, written in neat, looping cursive, laid bare a history that no algorithm or official transcript had captured. Religious bias woven into years of court rulings. Dates, case numbers, names, offenses, penalties, observations. Marginalia in pencil that read things like cross equals contempt, despite no verbal disruption, or hijab question, no legal basis given. Every page documented Judge Charles Hargrove's decisions with unnerving consistency, a pattern of targeting religious symbols cloaked behind legal language. She looked up, eyes tired but resolute. "You won't find this in the official docket," she said. "He always made sure the language stayed clean, but I kept this for myself, not to use, just to remember. I guess I needed to remind myself it wasn't in my head." An investigator leaned in, scanning the first dozen entries. "This goes back to 2013? He asked quietly. Mrs. Thompson nodded. "My first year under him. I noticed it during a case where a teenage girl was fined $200 for wearing a crucifix during a juvenile hearing. Her record was clean. Her behavior, impeccable. The reason? Courtroom distraction. But 2 days later, a man showed up in a profanity-laced hoodie. No fine, not even a glance." There was a pause. Cold, heavy, moral. She took a breath. "After that, I started writing everything down. Crosses, Stars of David, hijabs, rosaries. They all drew his ire. Meanwhile, tank tops with beer slogans? Not a problem. Shirts that said, 'F the system'? He laughed. Said it was free speech." One investigator looked pale. Another began marking pages with yellow tabs. A third simply stared at the volume, as if trying to absorb the weight of what 12 years of ink had now exposed. "Why now?" someone asked her gently. Her voice lowered. "Because I saw what he did to Jasmine Crockett, and for the first time the cameras were on. People saw what I've been seeing for over a decade. I realized I couldn't let her stand alone." Her hands shook, not with fear, but release. "This was never supposed to be evidence," she said. "It was just my conscience, written down." And now that conscience had become the most damning document in the building. A weapon not of vengeance, but of truth. And in that moment, as investigators leaned in, flipping through dates and cross-referencing with digital records, the illusion of neutrality cracked wide open. Judge Hargrove wasn't just a man having a bad day. He was a pattern, a symptom, a system that had finally met the one thing it couldn't dismiss: the handwritten record of a woman who had watched quietly for too long and was quiet no more. But the notebook wasn't the only record walking into that hearing room, because just minutes after Mrs. Thompson laid down 12 years of ink, another figure, silent for just as long, stood up. This time it wasn't paper that spoke. It was a man who had watched injustice unfold from only a few feet away and had finally decided to break his silence. James Wilson had taken his oath to serve the court seriously. For 15 years he had stood at the edge of the bench, neutral, silent, a fixture in Judge Hargrove's courtroom, like the seal behind the bench or the gavel on the desk. But when he stepped into the Oversight Council chamber and took his seat under oath, he did something that felt far heavier than standing watch. He spoke. His badge caught the light as he leaned into the microphone, voice low but unshakable. "I've been a bailiff in that courtroom since 2010. That's more than 1,000 trials, hearings, and sessions. And I've seen a lot of things you're not supposed to notice." He took a breath, his gaze locking onto the lead investigator. "You asked for patterns? I'll give you one. There was a day last winter, February 8th. We had a full docket. Lot of small cases, petty theft, disorderly conduct, parking violations, nothing major. He paused, jaw tightening, the words behind his lips suddenly heavier. That day, 5 different people came through wearing crosses, necklaces, lapel pins, even one guy with a small one on a bracelet. Every single one of them got fined. Some were told it was for disruption, others for failure to maintain neutrality. One woman was told, verbatim, "You're not here to preach, you're here to answer for your mistakes." She hadn't said a word. Gasp murmured through the room, but James didn't stop. Later that same day, a guy comes in wearing a hoodie that says, "Excuse my language, avoid the system." Full letters, bold print, right across his chest, walks right past the bench. Judge Hargrove glances up, chuckles, and says, "At least he's honest." No fine, no warning, nothing. He looked around, letting the silence sink like lead. That's when I knew this wasn't about courtroom rules. It was about what symbols Hargrove personally didn't like, what made him uncomfortable, and more often than not, that was anything religious, especially Christian. The council members glanced at one another. Some scribbled furiously, others just listened, faces grim. James continued, "I've been quiet for a long time. I told myself it wasn't my job to question what happened on the bench. But after what he did to Jasmine Crockett, after he fined her 10 grand for wearing a cross and pressing record without ever even glancing at what others wore, I realized staying quiet was just helping him." He sat back slightly, letting the words hang. "I'm not here to tear down a judge," he said, his voice steady, eyes locked on the truth. "I'm here to tell you that justice isn't just about the law. It's about how it's used. And in that courtroom for a long time, the law wasn't neutral. It was weaponized against the wrong people for the wrong reasons. And for the first time in 15 years, James Wilson no longer stood by the courtroom wall. He stood on the right side of history. By the time James Wilson stepped down, and the last page of Mrs. Thompson's handwritten notebook was marked with a yellow tag, the temperature in the council chamber had dropped 10 degrees. No one said it aloud, but the message was clear. This wasn't just a complaint anymore. It was an exposure, and the system had no choice left but to respond. At exactly 11:27 a.m., the chair of the D.C. Judicial Oversight Council called for a closed session emergency vote under Article 4, Section 13 of Judicial Ethics Protocol. The room was cleared, reporters were removed, even aides were barred. Inside, 15 members faced the unthinkable, that one of their own had spent over a decade punishing Americans not for what they did, but for what they wore and what they believed. The vote wasn't close, it was unanimous. Effective immediately, Judge Charles Hargrove was suspended from the bench, not for bias, not for error, but for what one council member described as a chronic abuse of discretionary power rooted in personal ideology. His courtroom was sealed, his access revoked, his judicial calendar, spanning more than 3,000 cases, was frozen mid-motion. But the council didn't stop there. They issued a Level 1 emergency investigation order, triggering a procedural alert across the federal judiciary. Within minutes, all rulings and sentencing transcripts involving Judge Hargrove that referenced religion, faith, attire, expression, or decorum were flagged. Over 600 case files were identified in the initial sweep. Some dated back over a decade. Others were barely weeks old. All were now under review. A team of 20, comprising constitutional scholars, civil rights attorneys, data analysts, and judicial oversight officers, was assembled on the spot. Their mission was clear: trace the pattern, quantify the damage, find the victims. One investigator, reviewing early data, whispered to a colleague, "This isn't bias. This is policy, unwritten, unspoken, but clearly enforced from the bench." Outside the sealed doors, news began to leak, first in whispers, then in headlines. D.C. judge suspended over religious bias allegations. Oversight Council launches historic faith-based review. Number sign cross in court, now a legal firestorm. The Hargrove scandal wasn't just about one moment in court. It was about how power had been allowed to fester in silence. about how faith, when quietly worn, had been treated as offense. And now, thanks to a cross, a notebook, a bailiff's voice, and a woman who paid $10,000 without blinking, the scales of justice had tilted. Not perfectly, but undeniably. And for the first time in years, the system wasn't circling wagons to protect itself. It was finally turning the light inward. The collapse came not with a bang, but with a series of quiet, irreversible doors closing behind him. In just 72 hours, Judge Charles Hargrove went from commanding a courtroom with a single gavel strike to being a pariah in the very system he once controlled. His chambers were cleared, his judicial portrait quietly removed from the courthouse wall, and his name, once etched in polished brass on the D.C. Circuit Board, was taken down overnight without ceremony. When he returned to his private office the day after his suspension, the silence was louder than the press outside. Colleagues who had once praised his firm grip on courtroom order no longer returned his calls. Emails from fellow judges stopped arriving. One former mentee, now a federal circuit judge, replied with a single line, "We're under review. Please don't contact me again." The Washington Post's front-page headline read, "The Robe of Bias, Judge Hargrove's Pattern of Punishment Exposed." Inside the courthouse, even junior clerks spoke his name like a cautionary whisper. The same halls where bailiffs once stood aside for him now buzzed with hushed stories, some fearful, some vengeful. One longtime clerk reportedly told a colleague, "We always knew he had a problem with those cases. We just never thought anyone would actually catch him." But the public caught him, and they didn't let go. Outside his gated home in Northwest D.C., a crowd of protesters gathered daily, carrying handmade signs that read, "Religion isn't contempt. Judges aren't above the Constitution." And the most damning, 10,000 reasons you failed. They came from churches, law schools, and veterans groups. Some stood silently, holding candles and crosses. Others chanted, "Hey Hargrove, can you hear? You're the bias we all fear." Cable news networks ran back-to-back coverage dissecting his rulings, with legal analysts circling his most egregious cases on touchscreens like crime scene evidence. Faith-based organizations launched a petition demanding a full federal ethics probe, and in less than 24 hours, it had over 2 million signatures. Even late-night comedy hosts joined in, calling him the judge who fined Jesus, mocking him in monologues that drew laughter but left a bitter taste. Hargrove, once seen as an institution within an institution, was now an exposed nerve in the judiciary. His name had become shorthand in public discourse for systemic religious discrimination cloaked in formality. Civil rights attorneys labeled his career a legacy of micro-tyranny. Politicians called for deeper reform. Editorials in major papers titled him, "The Warning We Ignored for Too Long." And yet the most painful blows came not from the media, but from within his own profession. The Bar Association of D.C., which had once honored him with a Lifetime Judicial Conduct Award, revoked the title publicly, stating, "Judge Hargrove's actions represent not just personal failure, but a breach of ethical duty that undermines the trust of all who stand before the bench." Law students across the country began using his case in classroom discussions, not as a model to study, but as a mistake to never repeat. He stopped appearing in public, stopped answering his phone. The blinds at his home were always drawn, and in the darkest moments of isolation, when the reporters left, when the protesters went home for the night, when even his voicemail stayed silent, he finally understood. He hadn't just lost a job. He had lost the presumption of righteousness. He had become living proof that unchecked power can rot from the inside out. No trial, no jury, just evidence, delivered by a cross, filed by a clerk, spoken by a bailiff, and carried to the world by a woman who refused to be silenced. And for Hargrove, that silence now belonged to him alone. He stood at the front of the hall, not as Judge Charles Hargrove, but simply as a man, one no longer protected by title, prestige, or institutional armor. The judicial training facility wasn't a courtroom, but the tension in the air was no less suffocating. Rows of young clerks, judges in training, constitutional scholars, and courtroom administrators sat in folded chairs, arms crossed, jaws clenched as he walked slowly to the podium. No fanfare, no introduction. Just an unspoken charge hovering in the room. Prove that your apology is not another performance. The podium microphone squealed softly as he adjusted it. He cleared his throat, not out of nerves, but like a man preparing to peel back his own skin. 12 weeks ago, he began, his voice hoarse but steady, I fined a woman $10,000 for wearing a cross and recording my courtroom. At the time, I told myself it was about order, about neutrality, about control. He paused, letting the silence linger. But it wasn't, not really. Every eye was on him, but not with admiration, with examination. He continued, slower now. What I was really defending was my discomfort, my unwillingness to share the space, my blind spots. A murmur rippled through the crowd, but no one interrupted. He tightened his grip on the edge of the podium. I once fined a cross, he said again, this time louder, deeper. I thought I was protecting the integrity of the bench, but I was only reinforcing my own bias, cloaked in procedure. There was no script, no legal shield to hide behind, only the truth he had avoided for decades. I've spent the past few weeks reading the First Amendment line by line, not as a judge, but as a student. I've reread the Lukumi Babalu I decision more times than I can count. I sat in silence and listened to audio clips of my own rulings. Do you know what it's like to hear your voice strip people of their rights without realizing it? To hear your own tone dripping with control instead of compassion? I do, and it changes you. The room was frozen. Even the skeptics weren't checking their phones now. I was a judge for 30 years, he said, his voice thickening slightly, but I only just learned what justice actually sounds like, because I heard it in the voice of someone I tried to silence. Jasmine Crockett. He looked down for a beat, then raised his eyes again, this time less to perform and more to reveal something raw. I used to believe that silence in the courtroom meant control, but now I understand that sometimes silence is complicity. That day, Jasmine didn't disrupt my courtroom. She revealed it. She exposed the imbalance I had let fester under my watch, and she did it with nothing more than a cross, a calm voice, and a recording button. A few in the back shifted uncomfortably. Others simply listened, drawn in. I've stepped down, I've surrendered my robe, and now I've chosen to be here. Not because I was forced to, but because I need to understand what I refused to hear for far too long. He let out a breath, then added, softer but with searing clarity, I once punished a cross for speaking too loudly. Today, I'm learning to listen to it instead. No applause came, just a long, respectful silence. And yet it was louder than any gavel he had ever struck. Because for the first time in his life, Charles Hargrove didn't rule a room. He earned a moment of grace within it. Under the blinding lights of the White House press briefing room, Jasmine Crockett stood tall, her navy blazer crisp, her silver cross gleaming like a declaration. Reporters packed the room wall to wall, cameras stacked shoulder to shoulder, and the air buzzed with tension as though the entire country was holding its breath. Jasmine didn't wait for applause. She didn't smile. She gripped the podium like a woman carrying something heavier than anger, conviction. Her voice cut through the silence with the sharpness of a blade. I did not stand up because I was offended. I stood up because millions of Americans have been silenced for their faith. The words hit like a lightning bolt. Flash bulbs popped. Pens froze midair. No one moved. She continued, her tone unwavering. This wasn't about one courtroom. This was about a pattern of punishing people not for crimes, but for convictions of the heart. She called for transparency, reform, and accountability, not just in D.C., but in every courtroom in America. By sundown, her speech had gone viral. And by sunrise, governors in Texas, Florida, and Ohio issued emergency orders for statewide audits of all rulings involving religious expression. Special commissions were formed. Judges were questioned. Case files reopened. Jasmine Crockett hadn't just survived a courtroom injustice. She had detonated a movement. The ruling came swiftly, but its impact would ripple through generations. In a historic announcement broadcast live from the federal judicial chambers, the United States Judicial Ethics Council issued a new national directive. No individual shall be fined, penalized, or sanctioned for wearing a religious symbol unless there is clear and demonstrable evidence that the symbol caused an active disruption of courtroom order. It was more than a policy shift, it was a constitutional earthquake. The directive was immediately dubbed the Crockett Standard by legal analysts, and within hours, judges across the country received updated federal compliance guidelines. But that was just the beginning. Days later, in a unanimous vote, Jasmine Crockett was appointed chair of the newly formed National Commission for Judicial Reform, the youngest and first Black woman to lead such a body. Her mission, to lead what the media had already begun calling the 21st century constitutional reformation. Across the country, murals appeared, billboards rose, social media feeds flooded with one iconic image: Jasmine Crockett standing tall before the courtroom bench, her silver cross catching the light, a $10,000 receipt held like a flag in her hand. It wasn't just a photograph, it was a declaration, a symbol of unshaken belief, institutional resistance, and a woman who turned a fine into a firestorm of reform. And when asked weeks later what she remembered most from that day, Jasmine didn't hesitate. She looked directly into the camera, eyes burning with truth, and said, "Freedom is not something you're given. It's something you stand for, something you're willing to be punished for, and something you fight to turn into change." The room went silent, but the country never would be again. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything, like subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.